Welcome to the Business of Travel, the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. I'm Cristina Chimenti, the Vice Chair of the People and Culture Committee, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Joining me today is Nick Hebrant, who is going to talk to us about digital accessibility. Accessibility in digital travel platform is getting a lot of attention right now, but if we're being honest, most organizations still treat it as a compliance checkbox. So let me start there. Are companies actually at risk, or this is some temporary hype?
Well, Christina, I would say that many companies underestimate the complexity of digital accessibility and overemphasize a little bit on the end goal. And in that sense, accessibility is not just a compliance with just a goal, an end goal in sight. It's a journey, it's a mindset, it's a complex one that is involving multiple teams across an organization, and the guidelines are not as clear as we think. And then if you bring this into the business travel world where the IT platforms are complex and global, then that complexity with accessibility scales very quickly.
To set the context then, can you maybe just briefly walk us through what your role is and how accessibility fits into your responsibility at Amadeus IT Group?
Sure. So I am a product manager at Amadeus IT Group for our product, Amadeus Cytric. It's an end-to-end travel management solution for corporations, so an online booking tool. My domain focuses in two parts. One, I focus on the user experience for our travel product, where you shop and book for travel. And then, but at the same time, I'm also the accessibility compliance manager for our portfolio, which has other products beyond just travel. And in that role as compliance manager, my goal is really like a conductor. My role is to help and align the product management strategy, engineering, legal, quality assurance processes, and the compliance so that it's handled consistently across the entire end-to-end process.
So that is quite a lot. So when you say you lead accessibility compliance across products, what does that actually look like in practice? On a day-to-day basis?
So it's actually quite a variety of tasks. As I mentioned, I'm a bit like a conductor. Some days I need to talk with engineering to understand, what the issue is. Other times I'm talking with our quality assurance because we need to run different processes and ensuring that the accessibility piece is also addressed. I need to talk with legal sometimes to understand the guidelines or if there are any legal ramifications, contracting, etc. And of course, working with the UX team to ensure that the designs are respecting the guidelines. So it really depends on the day-to-day and what the topic at hand is. To do that consistency, what I need to do is working with the different teams is ensure that we document very clearly the standards that we're going to be using and doing this across multiple development teams because, as I said, we have multiple products. So we want to make sure that product A, product B, product C all share the same standards in terms of compliance.
Makes sense.
Interpreting the requirements and making sure everyone understands it from the developer to the engineer to the QA, and then making sure that all of that is centralized so that we're then consistent. Because without that, then you have a hodgepodge of different compliance ratings for different areas of different products, and then it becomes really, really messy.
Yeah. I really like the idea of seeing you as a conductor for that. It is quite cool. So how about externally? You've been talking about internally, all the things that you're doing, but externally, how much traction is accessibility really getting? And from a travel manager point of view, where do travel managers fit into that conversation today?
Great question. So it's definitely be growing. It's a growing space and one with growing attention. I've definitely seen that. I've been doing this for the past 4 years, especially since 2024, where Europe passed its legislation on the European mandate on accessibility that was coming into force in June of 2025. It definitely perked up a lot of attention for global organizations, regardless if they were based in Europe or not. I definitely see it increasingly as a requirement in RFPs. So a lot of our pre-sales teams are reaching out to me to check, do we comply with these requirements, et cetera. And so when it comes to referencing accessibility, generally we refer to the WCAG. So it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and that is defined by the W3C. The W3C is a worldwide web consortium, so the three W's and C, which develops international strategies and standards, such as the WCAG, and supporting materials to make the web accessible for people with disabilities. These guidelines form what we see as the basis of how we approach accessibility from the design all the way to the development perspective. So they really set up together a set of guidelines. And again, the key word is guidelines. It's not like PCI-DSS where there's explicit standards you have to respect, etc. So in this, we're going to get into that where it gets a little tricky. However, it's still a maturing space. I see it quite frequently because the guidelines can introduce quite a bit of ambiguity of what accessibility really means. In B2C applications like online shopping websites, that might be more clear because it's a simpler external facing, everyone's invited to do that. But in the B2B solutions, such as ours in corporate travel, it gets a little bit murkier because there's legal exposure, contracting, there's technical efforts, and each company has its own culture that it tries to include with the technology that it's purchasing. And in the business travel space, it's generally treated as a compliance topic. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky in the relationship. So as it's seen as a compliance topic, it generally sits outside of the travel function. So I've seen a lot of travel managers not really driving the conversation. They're just being told by some other entity within their company that accessibility, the WCAG or accessibility has to be respected. And so the travel managers aren't really deeply involved and they're kind of stuck as a person in the middle, if I may say. And so it gets complicated just talking with them, but that's starting to change. I'm seeing there's an evolution in the conversations, and it's definitely growing. Like I said, maturing and growing in momentum.
No, that is really interesting because as a travel manager, I'm always interested in understanding how, what do I need to think about as well. So, and totally. I don't have a technical background from that point of view. So if someone like me doesn't have that technical background on the specifics, how should they think about the WCAG 2.1 accessibility guidelines, that's a mouthful, and what they actually means for a digital travel platform like, as I said, Cytric, but also others?
No, that's another great question. So, and I do see that a lot. So I think the foundation is, you just mentioned the WCAG 2.1 guidelines. So the 2.1 refers to a version of the guidelines. So you have WCAG, then you have 2.1 or 2.1, 2.2, etc. As I mentioned, they're not standards, they're guidelines. So they're like, they're a bit more vague. They should be like, the screen reader should be able to work. Your header and your ARIA attributes need to be this way. The color contrast should be approximately in this range. And with that, so I mentioned screen readers, color contrast, keyboard navigation, titles and headers. A lot of this is purely technical. So it doesn't make sense for a travel manager to understand all of that. Because 90% of the WCAG guidelines, and I think it took me, it was a a revelation when I started this is 90% of this, I would say, is in the code. It's in the HTML code or the developer code
Yeah, makes sense.
that the engineers need to handle. 10% is on the design side, so maybe colors and making sure that a button has a picture has an alternative text, those things. So they're really a small part. And so with that, it's very focused on the engineer. Taking that a step further is that there's about 50 criteria that apply on products, and not all the criteria apply to all the products because, for example, in one criteria is about audio and video, for example, and in our product, our booking tool, we don't have audio or video, so those criteria don't apply. Nonetheless, the 50 criteria can then be broken down even into more. So I've seen up to 147 different criteria that can apply to a single page.
That's quite a lot.
it's a lot, and I don't even follow them myself, right? So, and then the compliance report. So how do we document the compliance? So the compliance report is done through a template called the VPAT, Voluntary Product Assessment Template, or more accurately, it's referred to as the Accessibility Compliance Report, an ACR. They're used interchangeably, but an ACR is just a completed VPAT. That's all it is.
Gotcha.
But what's important to know is that these are not certifications. They're a snapshot of in time of what does your product look like at that time. Why am I covering all of this is the mindset that a travel manager should keep in mind when we're looking at all of this, is that as it's a guideline, it's a snapshot. It's not the end goal, right? And here's where it gets murkier on this VPAT or ACR, the auditors or whoever is filling these in, they simply mark something as compliant fully, partially compliant, which means that somewhere, let's say you have 100 pictures, one picture is missing something, so therefore it goes from compliant to partially compliant, or non-compliant. So it's kind of a all or nothing, which is a harsh way of looking at it. So, for example, you have a booking flow, you have 5 pages, and on one page, you missed one single criteria. Your whole flow could be considered partially or non-compliant, which is harsh, but it does make sense because, for example, if you have a screen, you need screen reader, and then somewhere on one page, the button to go to the next page of the screen reader doesn't work, then effectively that person who requires the screen reader then can't carry out the tasks. So it does make sense, but it's pretty harsh. And then the last piece, just to complement all this, is that nowhere in the guidelines is there any requirement of how much compliance you need to be. There is no 100, you need to be at 100 or 50. It's just a report of the state of compliance of each of the criteria. So, and I think it's important to keep all of that in mind because it makes it very difficult for you as a travel manager. Well, you don't have a single number. If you have like PCI DSS, it's very strict. Did you pass your certification? Yes, tick the box. In the accessibility space, it's not something that you can finish. It's a snapshot. It shows you how you are doing on each individual criteria: compliant, partially compliant, not compliant, and that's it. And so that's what makes it difficult for travel managers understanding all of this because it's ambiguous and it's complex. And so therefore, it's important to know that accessibility, as I mentioned in the beginning, is a journey. It's a mindset. It's what are you doing as a company with all your teams? Are you aligning all the teams? Are you putting in place processes? Are you ensuring that you're checking, that you're working with auditors, et cetera? And the ultimate goal that you want to see from a company is that the goal is that they're making consistent progress, whether small or big, but consistently making progress on accessibility compliance is what you want to be looking for, in my opinion.
Yeah, makes sense. So where do organizations typically struggle when they have to move or trying to move from understanding the accessibility and therefore all the requirements and all of the legislation that you just mentioned earlier to actually doing something about it and implementing it?
Yes, so that's something I I deal with every day. So another great question. Um, Accessibility, the biggest challenge is balancing the effort with and the ambiguity of the guidelines. So I've gone through various audits and stuff like that, and sometimes we have, like I said, we have 50 criterias. Each of them have sub criterias. We can see up to 147 elements that we need to check, and each one can take a few hours to check because the developer will have to check the guidelines, understand what the guidelines are saying, and then has to go through the product to then look at, is it there? Is it not there? And
Hmm.
that, so if you take 147 criterias with a few hours, you see how it scales very, very quickly in terms of time and complexity.
Yeah.
And it can become a significant investment, which is why there's no expectation, or it's not legally or even financially feasible to be 100% compliant with the WCAG. So, as I mentioned, there's no baseline on what actually has to be done, what is critical, must-haves versus nice-to-haves, etc. There is consensus among experts of, what of the 50 criterias or of which sub-criterias are critical versus nice to have. So, for example,
Yeah.
everyone will agree that screen reader and keyboard navigation are definitely on the must-haves to be done. But whether you have a picture, if it's not informing you of anything, but it's just something nice, does it have an alternative text? No, is it a problem? Not really. It's not great,
Yeah.
but it's not
Makes sense.
blocking anything. But
Yeah.
that the WCAG doesn't highlight that criticality in the guidelines, and so this is more at an expert level discussion. And with that, you get different interpretations, different experts. I've worked with 3 different auditors. I've talked to multiple customers, and everyone has slightly different interpretations. And the kicker is that it also is going to start varying across regions, across company cultures, and even across countries. So you have the WCAG as a foundational guideline, but then you have countries like in France, they have the RGAA where they use the WCAG, but they add some additional elements. The ADA in the US takes the WCAG in a more stricter fashion. So you get all of these different views, which makes it quite chaotic when you're working on a
Yeah.
global platform with customers that are spread, in 100 plus countries.
Yeah.
Um, so that's why most organizations will generally stick, even if they're in certain countries, they will generally just say, okay, we are adhering to the WCAG as a foundational guideline. If we're global, if you're limited to one country, you might look at that country specifics. But on global platforms, generally what I've seen is sticking just to the WCAG, and then you choose
Yeah.
the version. And today the standard one is 2.1, this 2.1 version. What's important as I mentioned, is that there is no standardized scoring. There's partially
Yeah.
compliant, not compliant, and there is so much gray zone in between partially compliant and fully compliant. It's not like there's a percentage, and that I think is what travel managers are starting to understand how complicated it can get. What I'm seeing from organizations trying to understand all of this and seeing the products they're working with, are they compliant or not, is, as I mentioned, they treat it as a compliance issue. So they have a team that's looking after compliance generically for that organization. And I'm not sure if they look at other elements, but they're not sitting in the travel team. So these internal auditors, let's say, are working quite a bit in a silo, and they're working on, at least what I've observed, is they are working and testing products without fully understanding how the product works. So they do it in a silo. They test by the book each element on each different page, and then they flag. What they're doing is, then I see that they're flagging a lot of issues, right? But without understanding fully how the full product works, and and the ambiguity in the guidelines is
Yeah.
that there are provisions that allow you not to do something if you're doing it elsewhere. So, as an example, I see every time flags from the internal auditors that are map views. So when you want to book a hotel or a car or a train, you can look at map view. And they constantly flag as super serious, the map view is not compliant. But there's a provision, and that's because they're looking at that page by itself. But in the
Yeah.
booking flow, the map view is a secondary page. It's just to enrich. Everything else is, the booking flow is done in a list view. So
Yeah.
our list view is 100% is, sorry, not 100%. Our list view is compliant to the highest possible rating, but the map view isn't. And so therefore
Yeah.
they're creating this this internal pressure on the travel manager saying your product is not compliant. Look at this map, blah, blah, blah. And then I have to go through this entire conversation educating the travel manager saying
Yeah.
that's true, but the list view is, so you don't need the map view.
It's not
And so
taken into
that's
context of the process flow that you're trying to follow as a product.
exactly. And I have
Yeah.
a lot of these kind of conversations. So all of this, it creates this creativity and subjectivity. And that's where the friction happens because there is a different perception between the internal audit team, what's communicated to the travel manager, than what comes to us. And I'd say that's almost 70% of my work these days is managing those conversations.
So, if you have to distill all of this down for travel managers, what should they focus on to navigate accessibility effectively without getting lost in the technical details and especially the technical jargon that comes along with all of this?
Yeah, no, it's tough. It's tough for travel managers, and I've been like I said, I've been doing this accessibility compliance manager for over 4 years, and it's been a journey, and it's taken me quite a while to understand. Talking with legal, talking with engineer, like
Yeah.
I'm at it a lot, so I've had the benefit of having time to educate myself. Travel managers don't need to understand the technical side or the implementations or the criterias and all of that. What my recommendation is, their role is to manage the conversations and expectations internally and externally of their organization. So I would say as a
Yeah.
travel manager, the tick boxes they can look at to sort of see where an organization sits is the first most practical one is asking, does the product that they're using, does that company have the VPAT, the voluntary product assessment template, or the ACR, the accessibility compliance report?
Yeah.
Asking if they already have that. That's already a major step because it's not as simple, it's not cheap to get an external auditor to issue one of those because of all the testing required. It takes months. So having that for me is already a major positive step in showing the mindset of the
Yeah.
company, investing the time to get that VPAT. Then remembering that the VPAT or the ACR are just a snapshot. It's not, because something shows in March, in by June or July,
It's not static.
exactly, it
Yeah.
will have evolved, right? And as we mentioned, there is no single standardized score or goal that you need to attain. It's a journey, right? So as it's not a certification, it's a snapshot in time. There is no requirement either of how many VPATs or ACRs you should be doing. There's no requirement. It's not outlined by the WCAG. Best practice indicates, if you look at it from the industry, is you should be doing one approximately every 2 to 3 years. Every year is a
Okay.
little bit of overkill because of the cost.
Yeah.
Every 2 years kind of gives a balance between investment and making sure that you haven't slipped or you haven't introduced regressions into your product.
Yeah.
And then the other one is asking, if the product they're working with in the frame of digital accessibility, do the internal teams have are they educated in accessibility, and is there a process around, what is their process around testing and ensuring that features are accessibility compliant? That kind of gives it's great to do the VPAT ACR where it's that snapshot, but you also want to make sure the company has a mindset throughout the year in their development that they're continuously, as I mentioned, it's a consistent small progress.
Yeah.
And then the last So that's managing externally the communications with their vendors. Internally, a really big piece that travel managers can help is also ensuring that if they do have internal teams on their side that are being told to test a product, is make sure that that team is trained on the product, fully understands the product, work with the travel team, because many of these tools require configuration. So I've had feedback from some of our customers going, oh, the color contrast on this is not per requirement. And my response was, well, you guys decide, your travel team decided on the colors. So talk to yourselves, So it's really they really need to manage the communication and work closely with that internal testing team so that they understand the product and they understand the configuration elements, so that when the travel team does produce findings, they're as close as possible to reality and they're not flagging, elements that are not relevant or don't make sense because they're looking at it in a vacuum or a silo.
Yeah.
So other things you can ask as a travel manager is, is there a roadmap around accessibility? Is it clear? Just like UX, there's someone who owns the UX. Accessibility, someone should own accessibility, because I mentioned, it's like a conductor. You need to coordinate. So in our case, we have a compliance manager. That's me. So that shows also the mindset and that someone is responsible for that. As I mentioned, do they have specific QA processes? And do they work? And for me, this is a really important one. It's what has really helped us, is working with independent third-party auditors. So the reason I say that is each region, company, culture, and because of all the ambiguity, everyone kind of looks at things slightly different. I've seen from select European countries very strong focus on high color contrast, for example. But it is not at all a critical requirement. So working with third-party neutral auditors for me is the best way to make sure that you're having a fair view of the guidelines, and not what one customer or what one team says, view. Right?
Yeah.
And so I think if as a travel manager, if you see that the company, the product you're looking at, or the company has a VPAT, and that VPAT or ACR was issued by a third-party auditor, then it's a great indication of the mindset and the neutrality as best as possible in this ambiguous area, that they are way ahead compared to many others. It's not about perfection, right? It's never-ending work, and I think that travel managers can help manage by understanding the ambiguity, the complexity, and setting the expectations with compliance teams that, hey, this company does work with auditors. This team does have a VPAT. This team does have a ownership. The compliance team can then try to cool things down with compliance teams, saying, guys, this does not need to be perfect. They're showing their journey, etc. And that's where the travel managers, as a middleman, being more educated, can help manage external communications and internal expectations.
Yeah. So if you have to leave the travel managers with one final thought as a summary, what would that be?
So in a nutshell, I think, if I'm going to summarize, is don't treat accessibility as a validation exercise or an end goal, right? It's rather look at the vendor's mindset and capability of how they treat accessibility. It's making sure that it's being framed correctly so that their internal stakeholders understand what the vendor is doing. If as a travel manager, they understand that it's a continuously moving target, there's a lot of interpretations and subjectivity of what's important, what's not important, etc. And that progress over perfection is what counts, right? Consistent progress. Because ultimately, if you have an organization that shows that their mindset is really embracing accessibility, that's way more important than a company that shows a one-off, we're perfect, but they have nothing else around it. So showing that they can credibly improve and not just react is what I think is what a travel manager can really focus on when assessing a vendor.
Oh, that's amazing. And thank you very much for summarizing that. And I think this is taking us to time. So just to close, you have been listening to The Business of Travel, the official podcast of the Global Business Travel Association. For more information about GBTA and its work, you can visit gbta.org, and be sure to rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. Until next time, thank you for listening.